GCSE poetry, war and conflict, remains and poems to compare it to. Just before we start, I just want to say a quick thank you to the physics and math tutor for allowing me access to their annotated poems. For you to have access to these free cluster, make sure you click on the link in the description box below. Now I would advise you to pause the video to take note of the annotations. First, I'm going to read through the poem, and then I'm going to briefly go over the annotations. On another occasion, we get sent out to tackle looters raiding a bank, and one of them legs it up the road, probably armed, possibly not. Well, myself and somebody else are all of the same mind, so all three of us open fire, three of a kind, all letting fly, and I swear I see every round as it rips through his life. I see broad daylight on the other side. So we've hit this looter a dozen times, and he's there on the ground, sort of inside out. Pain itself, the image of agony. One of my mates goes by and tosses his guts back into his body. Then he is carted off in the back of a lorry. End of story, except not really. His blood shadow stays on the street and out on patrol. I walk right over it week after week. Then I'm home on leave, but I blink, and he bursts again through the doors of the bank. Sleep, and he's probably armed, possibly not. Dream, and he's torn apart by a dozen rounds, and the drink and the drugs won't flush him out. He's here in my head when I close my eyes, dug in behind enemy lines, not left for dead in some distant, sun-stunned, sand-smothered land, or 6 feet under in desert sand, but near to the knuckle, here and now, his bloody life in my bloody hands. So, just in case you didn't get that, a brief summary of the poem. The poem is about a soldier who is haunted by his involvement in a shooting of a bank looter. It also explores the repercussions of war for individuals who come out of conflict zones and raises awareness of conditions such as PTSD. So just going back and looking at the annotations, the poem opens in media res, or mid-action, which serves to confuse the reader, as they initially don't know what's going on. Now this mirrors the confusion of soldiers, as they were not emotionally prepared, or even physically prepared, for what was to come next. This may be Armitage making a societal comment, suggesting that soldiers are launched into situations they don't fully understand, and the lack of compassion for those individuals are risking in strategic military situations. By mentioning that on another occasion we get sent out, the speaker is saying that this one occasion of many, not an exceptional case, but a reality the soldiers have to deal with on a day-to-day basis. Soldiers are expected to deal with repeated exposure to suffering, violence, horror, gore without any help. Probably armed, possibly not. Now we'll speak about this again later, but here the speaker mentions that the looter he killed was possibly not armed, which suggests there's a slight chance he could have been innocent and not a threat. Probably comes first because this is what he wants to believe, as it provides justification. He doesn't want to reflect on the guilt. There is clear anaphora here, which shows how he's focused on the possibility of the killing being unjustified and how he feels guilty about it and later regrets. Sort of inside out, pain itself, the image of agony. Now this is gruesome imagery, which also shows the transition from colloquial to emotional. This rich imagery of pain itself, the image of agony, and his colloquial language comes from trying to pretend he has not been impacted. Writing the poem is a process of going over memories and letting his actual emotions come out whilst on leave and escaped from the conflict zone. Now, this is quite a gruesome part, tossed his guts back into his body. Now, tossed is connotes a lack of care, a lack of respect for quite a gruesome ideal, and it's not respecting the body. The body is treated like an object, which suggests that it is an action they are used to. They don't think anything of it, and it's a natural reaction. The body has no value. Conflict causes the devaluation of human life, and that's one point that you can talk about what Armitage is arguing here. Also, rhyme between body and lorry, or half rhyme, works to add fluidity, suggesting that this is a routine and they are used to it, because they have been exposed to so much death and so much violence that they are now desensitized to it. They have lost their respect for bodies and life. And finally, in these final two stanzas, blood shadow, the death stains of a person in the conscious and in the memory. This is quite a really strong depiction of how it leaves a mark on the person and really communicates the struggle that soldiers have with PTSD. Leave, but. Now, caesura in the end of this stanza provides finality. It should be final, then I'm home. But the use of but suggests that war zone does have a lasting impact, and it doesn't end when the war has ended. It continues throughout that individual's life. Now, but I blink, and he bursts again. So this is enjambment across the stanzas, which separates reality from memory. And there are lots of plosives here that are used because they have a very violent sound. There are also connotations of waking up in blinking, and the flashbacks are becoming so impossible to distinguish between the reality of when he's awake and when he's in a dream. And having to blink to try and make out the difference shows the merging of reality and memory, and the merging of the lines between insanity and what PTSD soldiers have to go through. But he's here in my head when I close my eyes. Now, this is a very surreal statement. It's sort of communicating to us as the readers that he is having these hallucinations. He's being haunted in his mind. It's stuck, and it will remain in his mind. And it highlights the fact that soldiers are desensitized by war, and it's stuck in their head forever and ever and ever. They are unable to get it out. But near to the knuckle, here and now. Now, the idiom here shows how the memory feels offensive. It still causes him pain, but it should be in the past and it should be forgotten about. Now, the final line of the stanza I am going to talk about more in depth later on, but feel free to make notes. So, poet context. This particular poem lacks the humour of some of Simon Armitage's other work and other poems, and instead presents a dark and disturbing image of a soldier suffering post-traumatic stress disorder. He actually made a film on Channel 4 in 2007 called The Not Dead, and has a collection of poems of the same name, from which this poem is taken from. And in preparation for this work, he interviewed many veteran soldiers of different wars, including the Gulf War. Now, the reference to desert sand in this poem suggests that it reflects the experiences of soldiers in the Gulf War. Let's look at the title. So the title is quite horrific if you think of the physical meaning of remains and the links to war. It's quite gruesome. It refers to the physical remains of the looter as well as the death and disposal of the body. It has graphic connotations, and it highlights how soldiers remain damaged beyond repair after the war is over. So it brings to mind the effects of war rather than what's actually happening within war. And it talks about how war strips a person of their individuality and their sensitivity to death, simply leaving them with just the remains. So it has so many different meanings this is why I have left it on screen for you to make notes of. Now let's look at language, structure and form essay points. We've talked about a lot of them. So the first one, we said how the poem opens up in mid-action and how it confuses the reader. We've talked about the enjambment, we've talked about the caesura. Now we haven't talked about the motif of guilt. So the speaker mentions the lute. We have talked about that actually. Probably armed, possibly not, which suggests his innocence, and anaphora is used to show the unjustified killings. We haven't talked about the final point, the ending, his bloody life in my bloody hands. And the final stanza actually breaks into 2 lines, so the structure is chaotic, which reveals the internal chaos of his guilt. The adjective bloody makes a pun of the violent, gruesome nature of his death, or could just be a slang or curse word. Also, the mention of hands and blood are often a symbol of guilt. If you've read or looked at Macbeth, they also refer to hands and blood when they talk about guilt as well. Finally, let's talk about and look at poems to compare it to. So Remains and Charge of the Light Brigade is the first 2 poems I think are a good match. In terms of similarities, both poems present the expectation that soldiers would not question authority and have blind obedience. Both poems also demonstrate the reality of war versus the presented propaganda perspective that glorifies being a part of war. In terms of differences, Remains presents the impacts of war on the individual, whereas Charge of the Light Brigade glorifies the collective impact of soldiers on a nation. And they also explore the impact of memory on soldiers. For in Remains, memory is damaging and causes conflict, whereas in Charge of the Light Brigade, memory is presented as a motivator, as soldiers hope to be remembered. Now let's compare Remains and Bayonet Charge. So both poems are presented as a psychological impact. In Bayonet Charge, the speaker questions his role in the war. In Remains, the theme of PTSD is explored thoroughly. Both poems also present soldiers that are scared. In Remains, the speaker is scared of the past, of what has happened, and it's continuing to haunt him day by day. And Bayonet Charge, the soldier is scared of the future, the battles. He is scared of dying. In terms of differences, Remains, the speaker tends to focus on the short-term effects, whereas in Bayonet Charge it tends to focus on long-term. And in Bayonet Charge, it's recorded instantaneous impacts during the war, such as, people dying during that minute, whereas Remains is more of a repetitive, cyclical thing after the war, the impacts, the long-lasting impacts. So thank you for watching. If you found this video helpful, be sure to subscribe, and for more videos, for more advice, make sure you check out my Instagram at NoWaffleGCSE. Remember, we do GCSE videos on not just English literature, English language, geography, religious studies and French. So make sure you check them out. Thank you for watching and see you soon.